very few times one finds the right way to actually start an event with the drums and the music that one would always expect precede any introduction. Thank you for being here tonight. It's a cold night in the fall of New York, and yet we are here to try to discuss something that will probably hit very fast, or blood and or ideas, that has to do with the questions of politics, not only behind performance, but also behind many of the practices that as architects, as artists, or as dancers carry a certain history or a certain legacy. The idea of politics probably is one that we have too often in our emails, in our cell phones, and yet at the same time, it is important that we constantly try to address it from a deep space of expertise and interrogation. What politics means for art, for architecture, is something that we are constantly trying to address. We are here today at the Storefront for Art and Architecture presenting a project that started by bringing two different artists, architects, scholars, that have, through their work, really addressed issues of space with different agendas. And I think that the kind of convergence that this project brought is probably one of the dreams that any architect and curator could actually have. Bryony Roberts and Mabel Wilson do not need any introduction, and they are already familiar faces for many of us. But before we even give them the stage to explain about this project, Marching On, that was presented this last weekend as part of Performa 17, I want to give the microphone to one of the key individuals who actually made this project be part of one of the most important biennales of performance, of art, of experimental ways of addressing and understanding what the city is and what the city means. And so representing Performa 17, we have Charles Auvin, however I pronounce that. So please give him a welcome and a thank you, a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eva. Yes, so maybe are you familiar with Performa, or so just maybe a few words. So Performa was founded 12 years ago by Rosalie Goldberg as a biennial for new commissions. We commission artists, but also architects, but also theater people coming from the theater or people coming from the dance world, as a way also to kind of rejuvenate the field of performance. The biennial is very much linked to the city of New York, and as you said, I think that we always start with an artist, but we then think about the right place or the right meeting point between the artist and the work and the place where it's going to happen. Here, when we met for the first time, I think a year and a half ago, your interests, Bryony and Mabel, actually were resonating with some of the aspects that we were also interested to look at Performa, with this question of the intersection of performance and architecture, which has always been part of the biennial, but that we wanted to take even further. And it felt very a wonderful collaboration to have with Storefront to actually think about this question of access to public space, or at least, or presence in the public domain. And the research that you were doing around the history of marching bands and this project that you were taking even further from what you had experimented in Chicago 2 years previously was very exciting, and we were really proud to accompany also the project and to meet and talk and hear about the different stages that it took. It was a wonderful experience this weekend. I think I had been to a couple of rehearsals and saw how all the participants were very dedicated and very committed to the project, and clearly the pleasure that all the participants had during the performance was also something that was very touching and also meaningful. So I wanted to thank you, and I think I will leave you the microphone. No.
Yeah, just a second. Thank you, Charles. One of the incredible stories about this project is when suddenly one starts finding allies, right? And this project started maybe 2 years ago, when the night after the premiere of the Chicago biennial, I was moved for the first time in a real visceral way, right? The performance that Bryony had produced, it set a lot of question marks in my way of understanding space and race and politics. And I did have a lot of questions and I didn't have many answers. And that night, I was like, Bryony, I have a lot of questions, can we talk? And we started talking, and I remember in the way back, flying back from Chicago, I started Googling and trying to figure out the politics of performance, trying to understand, because I'm not American and I don't understand race. And so when Mabel, who was in our board, in the Storefront board for many years, I remember one of our coffees, I was saying, I don't understand the politics of race because I haven't grown up here and I don't understand them fully and deeply. And as one of the experts, obviously, in the field, I always felt that I did not even know how to ask the right questions. And so there was something in there that I knew I didn't know, but that some people could figure out. And so that's when suddenly Ginny Kanduja, who is sitting in the back, she said, Eva, there is a grant opportunity for the NEA in which we could apply for something that has to deal with visual arts. And I said, wow, that's definitely visual arts. And I remember the first thing was to ask Bryony, would be you willing to work with Mabel Wilson? And Bryony's like, yes, I would, of course. I love her work. I was like, Mabel, would you be willing to work with Bryony on like this project? And Mabel was like, yeah, I love her work, I do. And it was a kind of a marriage by application, right? And I do feel that like my job as an enabler, as a midwife, sometimes is just to connect points and people and to say, now do something, right? Now you go and figure it out. So that's how this experiment started. Then this weekend we saw the first visible side of it. And we are here today to hear more about how this started, the conversations that you guys have had, the conversations that are happening that we never heard of. Where are we today and where are we going to be here in May, in the spring of 2018, when we are going to have an exhibition in this space. We don't know the form it will take. Probably this event or this conversation is going to be really part of that process. And so, first of all, I just want to say thank you to the both of you. It has been incredible to work with you, the team of Storefront, from Max to Ginny to Carlos to all our interns who have actually helped and assisted in making this happen have been incredible and incredibly thankful for your generosity and your method of working. That is not always something that one can say. And I also want to thank Performa for embracing this project as part of your biennial. So with that said, the ground is yours. So tell us about Marching On. Take us with you.
You have the clicker, great. Well, first I just want to say thank you to all of you so much for making this possible, because really it would never have been possible without Eva inviting us to work together, and also all of Storefront creating the support, the financial support, helping us do everything to make this possible. And thanks also to Max, who didn't appear on the first slide, but should be on there. And to Performa for being excited about this and welcoming us into your fold. Yeah, so I guess I could start by, this was the project that Eva was talking about in Chicago for the Chicago Biennial in 2015, which was a collaboration that I did with the South Shore Drill Team, an incredible group from the south side of Chicago. And this piece thematically was quite different than what we were working on, but it did, as Eva said, raise these questions of race in America and the accessibility of public space. In particular, it was about the idea of order, the ways that we order space, the way that we order bodies. And I thought there was this interesting resonance between the extreme gridded order of the Miesian space and the extreme gridded order of drill teams, but how they're actually coming from very different places. They align formally, but have divergent kind of political associations. So yes, Eva invited us to work together. And we can keep going, actually. And what we have been doing basically for the last year is the research that's fed into this project, which I'll have Mabel go into more deeply because she is our sort of resident expert. And also thank you to Mabel for being such a wonderful collaborator through all this.
No, again, thank you, Ava, Charles, Storefront, Performa, for really making, and there were a number of organizations, the Marcus Garvey Alliance, we got support from the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, the Graham Foundation, the NEA. It's like it took a village to put this on, but especially the Marching Cobras, who were extraordinary collaborators. I mean, they range in age from 5 to 20-something. Yeah. Terrell and Kevin, who are the lead choreographers and directors, and also the families that really support, all of the participants, the Cobras, and being there. So it really was a really large joint effort. But one of the things that provoked me, and I just want to go back to this, because I remember this conversation with you in Chicago, and Ava kept saying, "What is this? Why are black people like so excited about twirling rifles? Like, what's that about? Like, what is the military overtone to this piece? And like, is there something to mine here to think about?" Which I thought was really profound. I kept saying, "Well, it's not exactly military, but it is military if you look at the uniforms." And I think that's what kind of set off the conversation and the research for Bryony and I to think about. And so these were just some of the images that we actually presented to the Marching Cobras initially, to sort of think about, certain histories of marching. New York in particular had a very, there's an amazing book actually of the history of African Americans and marching bands. And one of them looks at the history of New York City, the fact that free blacks were one of the first groups to actually march in the city right around or just before the Civil War, which was very unusual. And so there was always a history of blacks, and I use the term black rather than African American because I'm talking about pre-Civil War, that blacks would often fight on all of the American wars, from the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, especially after the Revolution, because the Constitution and state laws banned blacks from having guns. They were often drummers for keeping, the kind of military formation. So there's a long history of association between blacks, participation in the American military, and all the way up to the Civil War, where blacks actually fought alongside Union soldiers, as well as for the Confederacy, oddly enough. So there was this kind of interesting history. And then after the Civil War, blacks began to march in their old uniforms to say, wait a minute, Jim Crow is telling us we can't be in this public space. What's that about? After we have historically fought for the values of the country. And that was something that I think intrigued us about, okay, the march isn't just sort of saying we're here and we're American, but American hasn't somewhat lived up to its promises.
Yeah, and I think that it addresses this theme that we've been talking about throughout, about military and militancy, and what is the relationship between those two, and how did forms of protest within black communities use the uniforms, the music, the movement of the military as a kind of cloak for resistance.
Yeah, and so these were all, sort of different examples. You have the Harlem Hellfighters at the top, who were a regiment that fought actually in World War I, and then they came back and they had one of the first parades of troops returning.
I'll click while you talk.
Of some of the first, there we go. Yeah, that's the Hellfighters. And supposedly 1 million New Yorkers came out to see them, as they marched up Fifth Avenue. But again, they were returning. They'd fought bravely alongside the French against the Germans, but they came back and they couldn't get jobs and they couldn't work, and they couldn't get decent housing, and there were lynchings and riots they were facing. And so again, that was really important. And they were famous. They were a really important band as part of the Hellfighters, and contributed to the transformation of march music in relationship to jazz. So I don't know. But it's interesting, their kind of insignia is also the insignia of the Marching Cobras. So there's a historical linkage which the kids actually didn't really know about. Yeah. So it was great that we could sort of inform them about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like Mabel said, there's this interesting link to the tradition of sort of music and other forms of performance that started coming out of marching. So as you had people returning from different wars and going back into civilian life, they would use their musical training for entertainment purposes. And so you get these interesting hybrids of jazz and marching and ragtime. And then throughout the 20th century, also as marching started to be used for athletic teams, for church groups. You would see also these kind of hybrids of dance and marching. We'll actually get there a little later.
Yeah, and the Hellfighters were a very significant band in that period for changing dance styles because of the syncopation of the march.
Just some of the how the public space is transformed by that experience of watching the march.
Yeah, and so there were also marches for rights, which are very important. And this is a very famous silent parade, which had its 100-year anniversary this year, which was organized by W.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP, along with clergymen in Harlem. And this was against recent riots that had, devastated black communities in the United States, and also against lynching. And it was a silent march. So men, women dressed in white, children marched in orderly lines down Fifth Avenue. So it was very, very, very powerful experience around the absence of sound and jubilation in the tradition of march.
Yeah, and they just had a steady drum beat as the only accompaniment. So it's interesting to see this theme of the drums, the snare drums, kind of reappear through all these different forms of marching. And also for Marcus Garvey's group, the UNIA, their marches in Harlem, which were often accompanied by multiple marching bands. So that was a kind of moment when the political overtones were overtly tied to the act of marching, and also declaring a kind of collective identity.
Yeah, and so the black nationalism, civic, various kinds of civic associations, and it was a way of being public, right? And the streets were one of the few places under Jim Crow segregation that African Americans really had access to as a community and could communally sort of engage one another. Yeah, and so you have the famous marches in the civil rights movement along highways, across bridges. So the march has a really powerful tradition about being seen, because segregation is spatial policing about where you can and can't go, especially in relationship to the public sphere. So the march was one vehicle of presencing, which clearly ties into Black Lives Matter's protests, the more recent. And there were marches for pride, for the jubilation and celebration of black culture. So the African American Day Parade in Harlem still goes on. There's the famous Bud Billiken Parade in Chicago. And so these are long-going traditions. And then the historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, have a really amazing tradition of marching bands, particularly in terms of the formations that they do, and the uniforms, particularly the capes, which were inspiring for us.
Yeah. And it's kind of amazing how, particularly this group, the FAMU band, or the Marching 100, they historically kind of invented all of these much more expressive dance routines that are now part of mainstream marching band culture throughout all kinds of American universities. But a lot of the kind of creativity that originated those things came from these schools.
Yeah. And one of the people whose work we looked at is a photographer, Jules Allen, who has done really amazing work, both literally being embedded with the bands, but also just looking at the history of marching bands in cities and black communities.
So we had a lot of material to work with, a lot of research material to inspire us, and we did try to fold in a lot of these different elements, and will continue to, especially with this exhibition. So it's been really a wonderful pleasure to think about the way that research, theory, performance, and exhibition can all relate to each other, so that you can work with content in all these different media and different formats. So the way that it influenced the performance, forgot this part, just to talk about the relationship to urban space and architecture.
Yeah, so these were some of Jules' photographs, in terms of the different kinds of formations, their relationships with the architecture of the city, the ideas of order, repetition and symmetry. Yeah, so we used these very early on to sort of think about the history in relationship to the city.
So for this project, before I describe the sort of design ambitions behind the project and the references, we were lucky enough to work with this group, the Marching Cobras of New York, which is a group that rehearses in either Harlem or the Bronx, but the people who are a part of it come from all the the 5 boroughs. So, Brooklyn, Staten Island, some are even coming from Westchester. But they come every day after school and they rehearse for 2 hours, and then they perform multiple performances every weekend. So they're working really hard. It's a very intensive program, and it's part of an attempt to create a kind of community, a family for all the people involved, but it's also about kind of achievement and success and keeping people committed to school and committed to their futures and being ambitious about what they can do. So it has a kind of comprehensive ethos.
Yeah, and they've performed in a number of places, Super Bowl,
in the movie
Birdman. They've been in Vogue. They just did Rihanna's fashion show. I mean,
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. They get around, and they just spent a week in London thanks to people that they met at the Storefront Gala.
Yeah.
So so they're really dedicated group of they're a family essentially.
Yeah. And then the site that we chose was Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem, which is interesting on many levels that we could talk about. I mean, for me, what I thought was interesting was with the Chicago site, that was a monumental building and then a monumental type of performance kind of confronting each other. There was a lot of force in that. But it was also more distant in the interaction between the viewers and the performers, and it was highly structured. So I thought it would be interesting to do a project with landscape where there could be a more complex and maybe ambiguous relationship between the context and the performers. They could start to, weave in and out, be confused at times, and then also to do something much more intimate so that the audience would be right there with the performers and there could be more of an exchange. Our process also in doing this project was a much more prolonged process of exchange with the performers. So we did, multiple workshops with them, talking about the history, talking about the site, and then just many, many, many rehearsals. So it was a very personal kind of process. So, yeah, and then of course the association in Harlem, it's near all of these places where many of the groups that you saw had marched. It's also in a site of transition at the moment because this is sort of smack in the center of Harlem, at the edge between Central Harlem and East Harlem. And currently all the buildings around it are skyrocketing in value and the area is becoming rapidly gentrified. So the fact that there is a regular drum circle in this park, the fact that it's been used as performance space for local residents for years is now becoming contested. And you have a lot of complaints about noise and a lot of conflicts with new residents. So it really felt like an important space to kind of reassert the right for presence, for performance, for kind of continuation of that local history. Okay, and then in terms of the design, we got really interested in this theme of camouflage, of the idea that marching bands themselves were a form of camouflage that allowed people to occupy public space. It was a familiar form, if we think about the 19th century, the early 20th century, it was familiar from the military, from popular entertainment, and it enabled people to be places otherwise they would have been restricted from. So to create the atmosphere of camouflage, we worked on the costumes. And here's a collage that just kind of heightens that effect. But to click forward for a second, so the performers are all wearing capes, and the pattern on the capes merges, the sort of geometric pattern merges the paving pattern of the park with a pattern of camouflage, military camouflage. So it's referencing the kind of military forms we were just talking about, but then also the context itself. And then the uniforms for the drummers are echoing the Harlem Hellfighters military uniforms with the olive green, just like the World War I army attire. And then on the right, the dancers are in white, which is referencing the silent parade. So this is sort of a reenactment in some ways of those two important moments of protest or claiming rights to the street. So you can see how this plays out in the performance. The drummers, well, everyone switches their capes halfway through. So at one point they go from kind of referencing these historical groups to becoming the Cobras. So the colors on the inside are heightened versions of the paving pattern colors, but they're also the colors of the marching Cobras. So about halfway through, the choreography changes from these sort of more rigid drill formations to these much more expressive and individualistic kind of hip-hop routines with also elements from African dance.
Yeah, and so in the performance, they're coming, they're in 3 distinct sections. So the dancers are coming from opposite ends, and they come in silently and very somber, and then you hear the rhythm of the drums, and the drums come in, and then they do a series of drill formations, which for the Cobras was interesting because they typically don't do that kind of marching. So, so for them it was discovering a new kind of art form in terms of, like, okay, the march can also be in this very kind of steady drum rhythm, right? Yeah. And then it just sort of, at one point, it just flips literally to, their rhythms, beats, and movements.
Yeah. And Terrell Stowers, who is the director and also one of the head choreographers, he was saying it was kind of, the drills were kind of taking them back to the roots of the art form. So he would also talk about that with them kind of in rehearsal. And here you can just see, so, marching is very much, or at least marching performances are very much about lines and lines moving in and out of each other. So that's something that we played with a lot, thinking of it also as a form of architectural drawing, kind of defining space, marking boundaries, and then having those boundaries be crossed. But of course, we don't work with drawings when we're choreographing these. The choreographers work through sort of putting people there, trying it, and seeing what happens, and then shifting and adjusting. So it's a kind of drawing through, literally through bodies rather than through representation. And then as they left at the end of the performance, they left to the street, to the sidewalk, and filed out in a single line, sort of going off into the city to continue the protest.
Yeah, they have a rhythm called O2. And so it's a strut, and so they strut back out into the city right afterwards. And so it's I thought a very powerful way to end the piece.
Yeah. So I think we have a little video clip, just to give you a taste of what that was like. And then in the exhibition we'll have, and actually, whoop. And on Facebook, by the end of the week, we should have the video documentation of this. This is part of the second half when they flipped into the marching Cobras mode.
Okay, maybe we can, I think it's good to take this opportunity to have some questions also from the audience, but maybe also a conversation. It was interesting as you were talking, Mabel. I just remembered that maybe 2 years ago, in a day as cold as today, we had a conversation here on the end of public space, like the militarized metropolis, right?
Biotech,
in a moment in time in which the city was really being taken over by police, by the structures of surveillance, and also talking about the end of protest, right? And the way in which protesting doesn't really help move us towards the spaces of engagement or discussion so maybe, and this is a question to both of you, maybe resonating and taking over that conversation, maybe we are at the end of protesting and at the beginning of marching. But taking on the undertones and the problematics of militarized metropolis, right? How do we feel when, in fact, the militarized presence is so clear within this idea of marching? I think that's still part of the kind of legacy, right, that we have been talking historically. But But maybe you could talk a bit about where are we now? Like, how do we take these as a kind of a reflection of a moment in which we are constantly being within a militarized state of engagement, right? Any act in public space always carries particular social and political consequences. Just a few months ago, I think, they took away the law that didn't allow you to dance in bars, right? The cabaret law. I mean, we could not dance in the city for 70 years or more. And now suddenly we can dance. Maybe now we can even march, right? So maybe we can talk a bit about how do you read the notion of militarized within this protest, and how it has changed your perception of the militarized aspect of the performance by working and digging more deeply into the histories and the legacies of that? Or I'm trying to figure out, is this just a collection of anecdotes? Or are we really trying to see some things, identify some things, and change some things? Is something changing? Has something changed within your process after really looking into the militarist burden? I mean, we might just say it's not neutral, right? That something has military connotations and a legacy. So, and you have always rendered through a very positive lens. But so I think maybe it's more complex than just having rendering. So if you could talk a bit more about that conversation that we had 2 years ago and now bringing it back into the present. Sorry to collapse you in 2 years in one, but if you could talk a bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question around kind of what we've learned about, and just kind of what we've seen about the question of the military and public space, especially with surveillance, and we know about kind of hyper-police violence and, just the installation of cameras everywhere. I think, I think there is a kind of dimension of public space that has been much more controlled, particularly after Occupy, the Arab Spring. I mean, I do think that there is a kind of much more kind of hyper vigilance by state powers around that issue. But what I think, what I find really curious about what we discovered about marching is the kind of double-sidedness of it. That on one hand it tends toward a hyper visibility, but on the other hand it's kind of stealth because there are things that are also being hidden, and so it kind of has this play in it, which is why I think the camouflage was interesting in the sense that it's about being seen but not being seen simultaneously. But that will often be a kind of hallmark of black cultures. When Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates' early book, calls it a kind of double, not a double consciousness. Du Bois talks about it as a double consciousness, but a kind of, it is and it isn't, simultaneously. And so it plays with the kind of question of truth, like what truth can possibly be, as a way of dismantling, silencing, refusing resistance. And so I think, there's still potentially some power in maybe the play of it, but I do think you're right, the militarization of a lot. And now it's kind of, particularly of police forces, has now flipped back. They were demilitarizing it under the Obama administration. Jeff Sessions came in and said, no, we want to continue to give you SWAT vehicles and more bulletproof vests and all of that. So so I don't know if you...
Yeah, I mean, I think that was probably what I took, well, there are many things that were incredible that I learned from the research, but I think one of the ones that maybe influenced the project the most was this idea of creativity and invention and protest through this process of kind of inhabiting the form given to you by, in some cases, a very oppressive system. And so the way in which these very literal appropriations from the military, the costumes, the drumming, the formations, that have continued to the present. I mean, that's still what these marching bands look like, but somehow those could be highly literal quotations, but also, used for completely different purposes. And that difference comes through, kind of manipulations of the sound, of the movement, but also changes in place, obviously. And so I just found that so interesting as a form of resistance, that way of taking a system and then starting to kind of tweak it. And even also thinking about like this doubling or this flipping in the things that we read about these different marches. So for example, the Elks Parade from 1927, I think, started in Midtown and ended in Harlem. And this, so you could, there were these stories about how this one parade itself kind of flipped or doubled within the span of a day, because when it was surrounded by a mostly white crowd, you know, it was this very somber procession. And then as soon as it got into Harlem, it became this sort of like explosive celebratory event with people. You can see the picture I showed earlier of people, you know, on their fire escapes. You know, it became this kind of street-wide collective celebration. But it was the same form, the same thing, you know, from one part of the city to another. So that, I feel like that's a kind of incredible model for creativity. And the one that I'm particularly interested in now, I don't know if I can make any sweeping generalizations about that and its relevance for protest in general, but I think for both design and resistance, I think that's a really powerful direction.
Another question that, this one to me is maybe a more delicate one, but one has to do with the first performance in Chicago. Someone mentioned, you know, these kids, they are 15-year-old kids, they are after school programs. It really helps them out, right? To like find order and a kind of like sense of community. And you repeated some of the same tropes, Mabel. And yet when I saw that in Chicago and they were throwing things that look like rifles in a city that has do not wear guns in every door, I was like, I'm not sure what I'm seeing, what is happening here, what community is this? Is this, are you okay? And so the idea here is that I'm wondering the idea of race and class that is embedded within the act of marching and the marching bands. Because somehow, like, my dream would be that suddenly if we realize that marching becomes a real form for engagement, the production of like new aesthetics, and I mean, could we think that suddenly there is the marching on from Occupy, or from now the Paradise Papers, or there is the Soho marching band where all the artists that want to have affordable housing, like, is marching a form by which that double invisibility or that conscious or unconscious or duality can be really found? Because I think for us what is interesting also about Performa is how one is testing constantly, right? The boundaries of that, what is a form of expression, of radical action. And because learning from that, right? One thing is the community and the after school, and that what builds for those kids, but also seeing that also in a way in which we talk about it, it renders it as a specific socioeconomic issue, when in fact there is also, I think, a performative quality to the marching that we are learning from them, right? That we could learn from them. And it makes me question, like, how should we talk about marching and the marching bands and their socioeconomic status within a particular area, and how do we feel about that, right? Like, where are the other marching bands? Where are the highly elitist, posh kids that are marching?
Well, there's a lot, actually. Yeah, yeah, I mean, I think that's the much more well-publicized version of marching in America, I think, because you have so many marching bands throughout the country that are wealthy and well, from wealthy neighborhoods, and so I think it does have that dimension. You know, I mean, it has an elitist existence, and what's interesting about these groups to me is the way that they can exist within that world, but make it completely their own, you know, alter all of those sort of auditory, you know, physical structures for themselves. But I mean, because you can watch, you know, if you go down the YouTube rabbit hole of marching bands, college or high school, you know, it's really fascinating to watch the ones from different geographic places in America, different types of universities, and how you can read status in, you know, in posture, in formations, in all these different things. Yeah, so I think that complexity exists.
We have one question there, but maybe you want to go ahead.
Well, just very quickly, I was interested in hearing you maybe elaborate a little bit about your collaboration with the Marching Cobras, because the project was very research oriented, and I know that you've had a couple of conversations and you brought a lot of visual material, and so if you could just tell us a little bit more about how that worked and how they also appropriated the material you were bringing and how things maybe took different directions than you had anticipated maybe initially.
Well, I mean, we met with them in the Bronx initially, and we showed them actually the presentation to say, you know, these are interesting ideas. And I never forget one of the kids, I mean, because some of them are young, and we were talking about lynching. And she's like, what's lynching? Like, how do you explain to an 8-year-old what lynching is? And yet, there were 8-year-olds marching in the silent parade. So, you know, that these are can be very, very heavy topics in a certain way. But one of the first things we did was we met with them out in the park in Marcus Garvey, just to get a sense of like how do bodies occupy this space, and we had these circles. I think we both thought, we kept thinking something circular, and we couldn't figure out what, so Bryony made these big white foam core circles, and you know, we had them move their bodies, and you know, just to kind of get a sense of, you know, like what kinds of formations or forms can emerge from that. And then I think for all of it started to lead to ideas, and you know, just to get a sense of what can happen here.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, I think we were also asking them to do a lot of things that they don't normally do, because they usually march in parades or they march on street shows where they're sort of in a rectangular formation. And we kept asking them to move around the park and create these lines that would weave around the landscape, or do formations that would kind of split apart, and so, or do these very strict drill formations. And that was in their repertoire to a degree, and Terrell, I think, has a real strength in choreographing that, and I think really enjoyed bringing that in. So there were a lot of ways in which we were sort of asking them to invent, and Kevin Young, who's the other choreographer, you know, I remember one night he came and he was sort of tired because they teach, you know, they work full time, and then after that they run these rehearsals with these kids for 2 hours every night. So one night he was really tired, and we were like, okay, what if we do this? And then I think we started talking about these circles that would weave in and out, and he was like, oh, okay, now this is getting fun. Because he started sort of inventing all of these ways in which they could move in and out of each other. So we threw them a real hurdle, I think, in a lot of ways. But they also come with these sort of already these incredible, some choreography they've already worked out in terms of how they can, you know, move between each other, what their sort of micro formations are, and also the individual movements that are just unbelievable, you know, that we had never seen before and couldn't ever have imagined. So it was just so great to sort of see them like jump into action and do all these things that are just so even more doubly impressive, I think, when you think about the fact that they're 10 or 11, you know, these really young kids who are so committed to this group, and that's where they learn all these things. Often they come in having never danced before, never drummed before, and then they just learn it all there.
Yeah. What happened to the circles?
They became the capes.
Yeah.
I just think it was a placeholder for what eventually became the capes. And when we told them they were getting capes, they were like, oh my God. They were so excited about the capes. And then when they saw them, they were just in love with them.
Yeah. We were, so, yeah, in the beginning, sort of, we had these workshops about the history, and we weren't, you know, and we talked about it then, but, you know, we weren't sure how it would sort of keep re-entering into the rehearsals. And I remember I had a really nice moment when, during the rehearsal, one of the moms showed up, and then one of the girls came over to get her stuff, and the mom was asking, well, so what are you going to wear? What's this about? And then the girl started explaining to her what it was about, and she's like, well, it's about these historical groups, and they're marching in Harlem, and this, and it's like, oh, this is what we could hope for. And then the fact that they loved the capes really kind of made the whole thing feel like.
There's a question in the back.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. I actually had the same question about collaboration, and I wanted to know if it does in any way influence your understanding of architectural practice, how you collaborated with the choreographers and performers. Does that translate into architectural practice in any way or overlap?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of architecture as this much bigger category than built structures, because I think that really anytime we define space, that we create structures that guide movement or social interaction, that's a form of architecture. So for me, it's kind of all part of design practice. But I do think that it's so important that we keep going outside of the discipline to sort of learn from all other kinds of expertise to understand urban space, to understand what people actually need or want in the city. That's kind of the drive for me, is to sort of keep moving outside of just a purely architectural design agenda. And I mean, I learned so much about the city of New York and its history and the way that people have mapped sort of identity and territory over time through this project, that really puts and at the time I was teaching a studio also at Columbia in Harlem. So all of this research put that in perspective for me about what any kind of action in Harlem would mean, in relation to that history.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question, because there is a kind of history of theater, dance, particularly dance notation is fascinating, and then just performance in general, and like the ideas of event and the temporality of performance in relationship to architecture, I've always found really fascinating. So, I mean, I've been fascinated by film a lot, and I've done video work, but I'd never done choreography, even though I danced. I've done ballet. I mean, I've pretty much done it all, hip hop, African, you name it. So it was actually fun to kind of like mine, an understanding of the body in space, through choreography, and and so it was interesting to kind of remember that dimension of practice.
How do you see, after having done all this work, what is the best way to speak to an audience, like through an exhibition, right? I mean, we could think that this research becomes a book, or becomes a film, or becomes a series of documents. Like, what are the stories to be told, these lessons that you have learned, if you want, through this excavation, through this archaeological process, through this research process? Are there any ideas that you already have about how does one go on and talk about this project, or maybe the only way about marching on is about marching on? I mean, like, if you could just brainstorm and share a bit with us, what are your thoughts about the next steps of this project?
Next frontier. I don't know. I mean, I think we have a lot of material to review and to look at, because we have a lot of video footage, drone footage. The photographs are going to be phenomenal, but also the kind of was weird, because I remember that moment where it was like, well, what about the park? Should we do it in the city? We were thinking about the office building, basically, the Adam Clayton Power office building, which would have kind of been very similar to the, the Mies van der Rohe post office. But then, the park offered a very interesting kind of challenge around, like, all right, what does it mean to have these bodies where it's about the regiment of the city and the order of the city, and the park has its own protocols and order, and how do we discover what those are, particularly set against this kind of very crazy background of these. It has the reason the park is there is because there's a huge rock outcropping, and they literally couldn't run Fifth Avenue through it. So that rock is really there. It's like a mountain in the middle of Harlem. And so it's kind of this kind of interesting moment of resistance, actually, in the middle of the park itself. So I don't know, it just somehow set off a lot of or made an intersection of a very interesting set of conditions, basically, to work from.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to somehow create the environment of the park and the camouflage and this idea of legibility and illegibility in the exhibition. That's definitely something we're going to play with visually. And in terms of communicating the history, because I think it's just so important, and and the challenge of doing that in the way that's not didactic is always difficult. But I think what I hope we can communicate is not only how these historic parades would create spaces, moving volumes of space through the city, through their own movement, and then through the audiences that would gather and the kind of visual worlds that would make, but also understanding the social context that made that so important. I mean, for me, reading more about exactly how restricted, it was for blacks to be in the streets of New York, in the early 20th century, all the different forms of control, that everyone from the streetcar operators, the store owners, policemen were white, that everyone was sort of restricting freedom of movement and expression, that somehow that spatial social context also has to come through, as well as its counterpoint in the marches.
Yeah. And that's what's interesting, it's just sort of hijacking these institutions, basically, that then would allow you to be in certain places where you weren't, you couldn't otherwise. Yeah. So.
There is always, I always wonder, right, when people ask me, who is the audience of a storefront, right? And I said, well, it's artists, architects, scholars, citizens who meander and walked in. But there is an incredible audience in this project that is, it's not only all these ones that we usually speak and work with, but a much larger audience. I mean, a lot of the work that you have been doing visually, I mean, you were just at the American Academy in Rome, right? In where you develop very incredible patterns with the mosaics and so on. There is, and be able to take some of those techniques that now appear in some other forms in the costumes of camouflage, but now taken to a different body, right? That is a group of people marching. And I was wondering, how does one start to communicate with a much larger audience? Could we make like a manual for marching bands for the unearthing of their histories that are not just the validation of like where this thing comes from, that validates the legacy and the status of who I am, but sometimes complex histories that are more difficult, and to try to produce a kind of an understanding of those spaces that we might inherit that sometimes we are not aware of, and at the same time to force us into constructing new ones, right? I mean, we are saying in the spring, let's do another performance, right? With the Marching Cobras, we already said and you said where? And I think that's, for me, it's a very interesting question. Where is it going to be the next one, right? If it is not in Harlem, and if it is in Soho, and I'm trying to figure out, and I was actually trying to figure out who are the people that we should start talking to really unearth many of those histories, because there are so many. So what I would like us to think from now until May, right, is how many audiences we can bring to be part of this project. I think is an incredibly beautiful and important project because it brings people in very different ways. It awakens us, it makes us move. Everyone was moving on the park on Saturday and Sunday. And I think that that's ultimately what art or architecture or whatever discipline we want to do does. It moves us in some way and at the same time brings us some knowledge. Any more ideas, comments? I think there is some wine somewhere that I think we should go for. Thank you, Bryony, Mabel. Thank you so much. I look forward to the months ahead. And thank you, Performa.
Thank you. Yeah,
thank
no,
you
thank you.
so much.
You guys have been fantastic.
Yay.